Good afternoon and welcome to Columbia Business School Executive Education. We're coming to you today from our campus here in New York City. My name is Jason Belland and I'll be your host for today's session, Being the CEO's Boss, with Professor William Klepper. Professor Klepper is a professor of management here at the Business School and is engaged in a number of our executive programs, including the Columbia Senior Executive Program and the General Management Leadership Program. And before we begin, I just want to draw your attention to a few things. This session, like all of our in-person sessions, really benefits greatly from your participation. And so we want you to access the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen and use that to ask questions throughout the session. We'll take some questions at the end, so throughout the presentation, simply ask your questions and I'll relay those questions to Professor Klepper as we approach the Q&A section. And now I think we're ready to begin. Professor Klepper, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Jason. It's my pleasure to be here. And I was looking over the list of people that are joining us, and it's, as always, very impressive. Particularly good to see a number of our Columbia Business School graduates that are listening in. As you can see, we build this as being the CEO's boss, which, of course, is a tough bill of fare, so to speak, for someone to measure up to. So I thought what we'd do is start conceptually, and by doing that, if we could kind of think about what we mean by corporate governance. And let's see if I can advance to the slide here. Okay, there it is. All right, we're fine back here in the studio. So again, I think it's important to think of the CEO's boss within the corporate governance structure. And what I'm really referring to is the role of the board. Because technically, when you ask what is the main responsibility of a board of directors, it's to hire or fire the CEO. So that's where we're coming from with regard to this issue of the boss, CEO's boss. So, but let's broaden this discussion just a little bit as to what corporate governance is. We talk about it as a system of checks and balances among the stockholders and the board and the CEO. And since we're, of course, a country which is one that follows the rule of law, it's important that we look at the broader, I guess you might say, scheme of things here. So as you can see, and by the way, that little footnote on the bottom tells you that we teach this in our individual business and society curriculum within the master's program in business administration. But this is a slide which we say, look, here are the participants in the corporate governance process. And as you can see, we've got the board of directors right there at the center top. In other words, they're the top of the, what I'd call the power hierarchy. But there are people that they are constantly in communication with and trying to be beholden to, like shareholders. But they have advisors that help them with that. Their attorneys, of course, help them, their auditors, et cetera. Then within the corporation itself, we find our CEO and C-suite senior managers. But they, in turn, have a number of forces, of course, that are constantly, I guess you might say, impacting on them. Things like media watchdogs, other stakeholders, employees, customers, the community, your creditors, can't forget them, and, of course, the regulations that are ever-growing in our society. So that's kind of the general scheme of things. So let's look a little bit more closely because, as Jason told you, I'm a professor of management in the business school. We also have a law school here, and they have great strength in this area of corporate governance as well. And those of you that are board members, and I see there are a few out there, probably are aware of the fact that there are certain legal obligations that you as directors have. And let me just get some of the language on board here so you can see it. First one is duty of loyalty. And, of course, we always wonder, who's this loyalty to? So I asked Jason to kind of ask you a question. So let's see. Here's the question we have for you. So who do you think the directors are loyal to? Are they loyal to the shareholders? That would be A. B, the corporation, the company, the organization, depending on the way you want to use that phrase. Or C, both. So I'd be very interested in your voting on either A, B, or C.
All right, Bill, the votes that are coming in right now, fast and furious. The numbers are changing here. Let's just give it a second. And let's see. Okay, things are settling down. Just give it one more second. If you want to get your vote in, you can vote on the right-hand side. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now, and I will. I'm going to review that information. It looks like we have about 20% of folks saying shareholders, 12% saying the corporation, and 39% saying both.
39%. Okay. So I'm just adding up the percentages there. We got some no response. Is that what you said?
Yeah, there's some no
20,
response.
12, and 39. Okay. Well, the answer is if you were in the business school in the last decade, we'd have been arguing very strongly for this issue of shareholders, because the sense is that, look, they've got their treasure, right, and they expect a return on their investment. So you are representative of us, so that's what you should be constantly beholden to with regard to your loyalty. Of course, then we get along and we go over to the law school and they say, no, there's case law regarding this. And case law basically says that we're going to see if your loyalty in terms of the actions that you took as a board member are ones that advanced, or for the most part, were only in your self-interest with regard to the company, the corporation, or organization. If they were within your self-interest as a board member as opposed to the corporation, then you'd be subject to, well, let's put it this way, you might go to jail. So the answer is that you've got different ways of looking at it from different perspectives, but those people that said both, I'm in agreement with. I think there's a circumstance where both must be aligned in order to have the loyalty that is required with regard to boardsmanship. So let's keep going on this one, because this is the next one, duty of care. I'm not going to test you on this one, but again, to make a distinction, when you go in terms of the law here, we get into tort law, and we get into issues around, so what are the guiding principles that this board operates or this company stands for? And I'm going to later on talk to you about a social contract and how I think that's a key element that can guide one's duty of care. But for the most part, this is one of, are you doing things based on what you stated you had set out to do? So that's one that they want to find out. Now, here's the good news. The good news is there's a third one. These are the traditional ones, is the business judgment. So, by the way, if there's no question in the eyes of the court that you have fulfilled your duty of loyalty and duty of care, but you just had poor business judgment. In other words, you made the wrong choice with regard to your strategy, with regard to, let's say, the management of your risk, and this company is suffering in terms of its return to shareholders, in terms of the kinds of commitments you had made for taking care, the courts would look at you and say, well, we're all, you know, I guess you might say, of original sin, and so we're going to let you go this time. So business judgment, even though that's the third point, is one you can't go to jail on if you make a bad judgment, because we all are fallible in that regard. So that's kind of the general background with regard to this. So here's what board members are really facing today. Think about this loyalty, care, and business judgment. The big issues that they continue to struggle with is, do they have the corporate strategy right? And so when I get later on into some of the works in my book, I'm going to talk about the importance of how that's where it all starts with regards to aligning the CEO with the board. Is the corporate strategy right? Have we agreed to it? Are you clearly following that and implementing it appropriately? Then, of course, there's this issue of risk management. You can see that hasn't changed one bit with regard to priority between 2011 and 2012. Some people would say that risk is probably more important than anything that boards do. There are now committees of the whole that are being formed at the board level just to manage risk of corporations. And a lot of this has come out of course, the 2007 collapse of the economic markets. And then the next one is succession planning. And it goes back and forth with executive compensation, which I'm not going to get into. But succession planning is probably, if you think about the board's major responsibilities to hire and fire the CEO, if you're going to have a productive relationship here, you better have made sure that this is on your agenda as a board. So all of these are absolutely key with regard to how one becomes effective in their relationship with their CEO. The CEO, by the way, presents the strategy to the board, and the board approves it. If you don't have a good CEO in that role, providing what you would consider to be clear thinking with regard to your strategy, you're going to be underpowered. What about risk? You can have the best strategy, but if you haven't managed your risk, no strategy is going to bring you out of a collapse. And last but by no means least, this issue of succession planning is, I think, becoming more and more important. When you think about what is the average tenure of a CEO today, it's 4.7 years. 4.7 years. Now ask yourself, when's the last time you thought about replacing your CEO in that amount of time? I can tell you your CEO hasn't thought about it, but that's the situation. So anyway, I wrote this book to try and focus in on some of these issues like strategy, like risk, and succession planning. And let me kind of take you into what it said. You might want to take, I guess you might say, awareness of, and that is, the first thing you always start out with is, what's the condition of the business? I'll get later on and talk about that, but in many cases what businesses have to be aware of is where they are within their own, what I would call, business cycle. And so we typically talk about the S-curve in business, and I think you can apply that in the case of how you select the right CEO. You're going to need a CEO basically who can respond to what is the current condition of the business and where you want to take it. So many times I think there's a bad match between those two, and as a result of that, your CEO is ineffective either over the short period of time, and there are many examples where CEO doesn't even last a year, and other circumstances where the CEO has been around too long because they can't adjust with regard to their own capabilities and style for the requirements that the current challenges demand. So again, this is what I was trying to achieve when I painted this picture. So let me just kind of show it to you here, and hopefully it'll become evident to you. There's three major sources of research to back up this model that I've created. The first one is, as you can probably see in the footnote there, by Hamrick and Foltoni, talks about the seasons of a CEO. We have a lot of information about what the average CEO does and progresses over time within an organization. So matching that with some of the longest standing and most comprehensive research on leadership practices by Kouzes and Posner, we then get an idea of what should be the right match, depending on, I guess you might see, the season of the CEO with the practices that would best be evident by them during that period. And then ultimately, what about behavioral style? Does behavioral style enter into this? In most cases, when you read the headlines and they talk about a failed CEO or a triumphant CEO, they talk a lot about behavioral style. So again, I use the work that goes all the way back to Murrow and Reed that talks about behavioral styles, and they use the term social style. So how's it work? Well, let's assume, by the way, that you're a startup business. And I know from reading the list here, there's a couple of folks out there that kind of fall into this category. If you look at startup businesses, there's no question that where they start out, if I can click this for you, is they're responding to a challenge. In other words, they see a possibility, they look around, they see the status quo, and for the most part, they say, I can make a difference here. Now, for the more mature businesses, think about this in terms of being in a trough. How many of your businesses out there, you feel, by the way, are in a trough right now, in a downturn? Most of you say we've been there since 2007. We haven't come out of it. We're seeing a glimpse of it, but for the most part, we feel like we're still trying to fight through this downturn. Well, this takes a leader, by the way, that will respond to that, right? Whether it's a startup or whether it's a downturn, this is somebody that has to challenge the way things are being done, because if you don't do that, you're not going to go anywhere. So we talk about the driving style. Again, that's Murrow and Reed's designation. So let's assume, by the way, you've come out of it, though. So let's hope a number of you are in that situation. Now's the time to experiment. In other words, hopefully, you can see the possibilities that are there for you, but it's got to try something new. You got to be innovative, creative at this point in time, because what you want to do is inspire your organization to what is a potential future state. So a couple things that come true here is expressives, as Murrow and Reed refer to them, are creative kind of people. They are willing to experiment, and they like to have people surround them in those efforts. So If you look on drivers, by the way, it's kind of starting out in the garage, and then once they open the garage doors coming out, you can see this expressive experimenting style. And we can talk a little bit more about HP later on, but that's just one quick reference. So let's keep going on this. Now let's assume, by the way, that your business is doing really well. I mean, you have now not just quarters, but a couple years of just climbing growth. Well, this is an opportunity, by the way, where you have to figure out how we can keep it going. And so when I say enduring, think about culture building. Think about enabling others, because obviously if your company is growing, you're adding more and more people to it. And here I talk about the importance of being not just an amiable, but amiable in the sense of building great teams, because organizations are made up of people, and again, those are teams that are trying to advance the strategic priorities of the firm. To keep going with this model, let's look at then what happens here. Well, eventually, by the way, we reach kind of a peak performance, and unfortunately, we don't know this is happening in most instances until it's past, but things kind of converge. We've got the perfect model for how to do it right, but of course, the answer is that's also known as kind of a point of inflection. There are actually 2 points of inflection. There's the one there that when you come out of the trough, and now there's the one up at the top of the S-curve where you start to see the change in that, what would be sine curve or slope of the curve. And those points of inflection, analytics are very good at, because what they do is they try and extend that line out further, because it's a mature business and they can make a lot of money in the process. So you're looking for a model that can improve on that. By the way, if you don't get this, you'll end up here. It'll be too late, you'll dysfunction, and you'll fold. Both CEOs and their businesses, as a result, will do that. Now, I have another examples in my book about individuals who have progressed in this fashion. I tell the classic story of Jack Welch, who was very much of a driving CEO when he first took on GE. And again, they were in over 100 different businesses. And he looked at it and he says, look, there's no way we can operate effectively with 100 businesses. We've got to get it down to those, companies for the most part can operate in either one or number two. And so he got it down to around 20, all right? And he was known as Neutron Jack because, the buildings were still standing, but the people were gone. But he got it down to those 20. Think about the 80-20 rule. Those 20 businesses that accounted for 80% of his revenue. And then he started to give a vision. And his vision was, look, I know just 20 of you are here in the room with me today, but I'm telling you that each one of you can be either one or number two in what you do, and that's why you're here. And of course, he went on to say that, and if you don't, I'll close, fix, or sell you. So the old Jack of a driver, but the visionary Jack was very much in place. By the way, he went on to build a strong culture at GE too, but Jack Welch was never an amiable. So he brought individuals in to help build his culture, and the GE Learning Center, named after Jack Welch today, was established purely for that reason, is to create a culture so that as they grew as a company, more and more people would embrace what was at the core of the success of GE. And by the way, the analytics were also brought to the table by Jack Welch. When he had to learn, by the way, how to extend the life cycle of his product lines of his various companies, he brought in people like Bossidy with regard to the Six Sigma. He also had people talk about e-business models. So the point is that that's where he got his tremendous growth and we're able to extend it. We can talk later on if there's a question about how Immelt's doing, but the answer is Jack Welch is a good example of this integrated leadership model working. Here's another way to look at it, same kind of thing, but you can go across and ask yourself where you are in the business cycle. So what's the agenda, practices, and CEO style that's required. Here's one that I think I have offered in the book that I think, again, it's built off of the work of a number of people, as you can see down below, Hambrick and I think it's Fredrickson, yeah. And then, of course, you have Tushman O'Reilly. And really, you kind of know this as strategy development and strategy implementation, a model that's all put into one. Why is the CEO alignment key? Because the CEO has to drive this. This doesn't operate in a vacuum. And so I refresh for people that are on boards that it's important you understand what the strategic context is for your strategic intent. And so, how well have you been, I guess you might say, educated to your customers, competitors, the company itself, where they are on the business cycle, and the overall economic environment, and how has that translated itself into what your strategy is. So board members really, again, because they approve the strategy, need to be very knowledgeable of this. And so I recommend highly that every board retreat go back and look at the assumptions, right, the strategic context and the intent, and ask if it still holds up. Now, what is the CEO supposed to do? Not only does he recommend, or she, that strategy, but they have to drive it. They have to make sure that they get all the levers of the business system, you see them there, the structure and the process, the people and the culture, moving forward. And the way they do that is by, again, applying the right agenda, the right leadership practices, and behavioral style to make it all occur. Ultimately, you end up with congruence. This is, again, the Tushman-O'Reilly model that says if you get your strategy and the CEO and the business systems all aligned, you're going to be a successful practice. So those of you that are out there, this is probably old news, but just to reinforce the importance of it, because strategy is the big issue for boards. So what I talk about then in terms of, let's talk about your duty of care. What should be at the heart of your duty of care? Well, first of all, to build a productive relationship with your CEO, you should strike a social contract. And I've done this with a number of boards, and what it really means is defining what it is that your organization stands for as its first point of departure. And a good example of this, by the way, is a credo. And some of you are probably familiar with Johnson & Johnson's credo, one of the first ones that was formed back in the 40s for that company to go forward, and became very important in terms of how they faced some of their, what I saw called black swan events of risk. But anyway, the important thing is the board should talk about this. What is it we stand for? And I'm not talking about, by the way, the plastic card here that you can pick out all the values you like. What I'm saying is, based on what it is that you think is important, what do you have to say about them? And by the way, the Johnson & Johnson went on to say, these things are important with regard to our customers, our employees, our shareholders, and our community, which, by the way, are typical stakeholder groups. Then I go on to talk about risk. This is my recommendation of a list. It can be different, but if you're not addressing risk and have a clear understanding of how you're going to manage that risk profile, the board and the CEO, you're in a good position of weakness, of making some bad decisions and being in a point of weakness. Ultimately, then, I think transparency is key. I hear so many times that the board members cry ignorance when it comes to finally finding out about the financial or non-financial matters that their CEO wasn't sharing with them. And so there has to be a commitment with the board members that there is this kind of transparency. And last, but by no means least, and of course this is a plug for Columbia Exec Ed, is that I think coaching for continuous improvement is key. And so I work very closely, for example, with what is called the ODX group, which meets once a year, and they do a number of programs. It's an FT organization. Working currently with Korn Ferry in terms of some of their work with regard to corporate governance. And the important thing is that board members fulfill the need to constantly be coached in the responsibilities they need to fulfill. And then, of course, my big pitch, and this is the subtitle of the book, is so when it's all over, I'm asking that you exercise, you directors out there, and by the way, you CEOs, to invite this. Tough love. So what is tough love? And again, don't watch some of the current sitcoms because it could give it a bad name, but it's an expression used when someone treats another person sternly, meaning I'm giving you eyeball to eyeball, unvarnished feedback here with the intent to help them in the long run. So the commitment here is this is good for you. All right? This is something that we're doing because it's going to make you better. Not only better as a CEO, but better organization as a result. So to do that, I say the boards need to know their CEO style and leadership practices, which goes back again to some of the research efforts I referenced earlier. They got to know the strategy, priorities, and gaps. That's the alignment model, right? They got to match their needs and with the leadership that is required. And, you know, they should first look at their CEO, see if they've got it there. If not, look and see if the senior team or C-suite has the capability collectively to do it. And if not, look outside. That's part of being tough. And again, remember, I think any CEO that's worth their salt will say they would invite this tough love because they think it would make it better. And then I'm going to end my slides presentation, and we'll take your questions Well, what I see more and more growing into an impactful effort, and that is the lead independent director is really becoming more and more of a chief process leader. All teams need to be aware of the fact that they have two dimensions for their success. One is the task that they need complete as a board, things like approval of the strategy, things such as managing the risk, right? But also there's process. How well did they do it? And so what I give here is what we know from the behavioral sciences, that a lead independent director can effectively engage around things like the stage of development of a group. Not every group, by the way, is a mature functioning team. Every time a new member comes in, it starts over again in terms of a forming stage. The other thing is, ask yourself, what are the strengths of the board? And what do you need as a team? Many cases when you're adding new board members, you kind of do a matrix. And you say, look, here's our strategy. Here's the kind of expertise we need on this board. How do we match up? Should be doing that on an ongoing basis. By the way, the next one is, if you're looking at the behavioral style of the CEO, you might want to look at the behavioral style of the board members. Because I've seen split boards occur because of people not understanding and being able to effectively deal with in many cases, contrasting and therefore what might be toxic styles of members. I then go on to say that every person has their own need and orientation, the things that make them tick, and good board directors, particularly lead independent directors, need to be aware of that. And ultimately, you want to exercise leadership. That's really what board membership is like. That's what a CEO is like. It's about exercising one's leadership, and there's a lot of work in this area with regard to adjusting one's leadership to the situation, whether you become directive, coaching, supportive, or delegating, and that's important for board members to be aware of. So that's a quick run-through of what I had to offer to you. I do have one other thing, but I thought we'd kind of pause at this point and see if there's some questions before I go to some ending pieces with regard to your competencies.
That's great. Yeah, I think we have time for a couple questions, and I'll start with one that just came in. The question says, Professor Klepper, if you are in agreement that the board of directors' loyalty is that the board's loyalty is both shareholders and corporations, then who are C-suite executives loyal to, and where are the checks and balances or independence between the board and C-suite executives?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think the C-suite executives and the CEO themselves have probably as their first responsibility the corporation. And again, they need to put that as their priority. So in many ways, if the board is looking out at the shareholders and the CEO and C-suite is looking in at the corporation, collectively they have a team perspective and commitment that should work. But as we said, 39% of the people out there said both, and I would say both, but I think in many cases the CEO should be looking in and the board should be looking out and collectively gathering intelligence to how they're doing.
And now one individual says, oh, how can board members be the boss to the CEO if he's also the chairman of the board?
That's a classic debate, by the way. And by the way, it's changing here in the U.S. As you know, there are models, for instance, the UK, Australia, places where you'll see a non-executive chairman, right? And when people get into these discussions, they get into this issue of, well, it depends, right? But it's been very, very difficult, and there are many case studies that I've looked at where the chair and the CEO are the same, and that position has created some blind sides for the CEO and for their boards because you have an all-powerful position. So the trend is to move away from that, and if I had to endorse something, I would say that trend is a good one.
Just one more question, if we can. Looking at some of these ideas and principles, how can these apply further down the chain of command from top to middle management?
Yeah.
Can they cascade through the organization?
Yeah, the answer is that what you're seeing in here is exactly what I teach in the general management program that we run for 2 weeks as a residential program. I also teach in my executive MBA program on executive leadership. These same points are applicable all the way through. The only difference here is we've started at the top of what I call the hierarchy and tried to address it and apply it to that. But you can take it within any functional area and talk about the person that leads that functional area and the individuals that are part of that for the corporation, because everything, by the way, should have a line of sight to the overall company strategy. Excuse me. And within that context, they all apply. So here's my finishing point for you. Here's my director key competencies, and I'll kind of leave you with this. But what you're looking for is how well will I do with these areas? Because this would be the perfect board member. Everything from do you need development with regard to executive leadership to the no, that's my core competency. And you go all the way down through your ability to function well in meetings, communicate with stakeholders, your interpersonal relations, your strategic thinking, your analytical critical thinking, understanding of economic issues, industry experience, financial experience, legal experience, and last but by no means least, how creative, how much of a lateral thinker are you? And I give this to people that are on boards currently to kind of assess their own membership. And then I make this recommendation that if you've got a few ones in the room in any category, team up with the people who self-assess themselves as fives. And by the way, another way to do this is not fill it out yourself at all. Have the group fill it out for you based on their observation of how they see you. But the end result is you want to use it as a coaching tool for not only bringing up your game, but also to get feedback and have the board look as a whole. What I would like to see on every board and in their partnership with their CEO is all fives in all these categories. So that's kind of my final giveaway to you. And there's the book again, when it made top 5 lists when it first came out.
Great. And thank you so much, Professor Klepper, for being with us today. It's been a great conversation. And just some folks were asking earlier if we were going to send out the presentation, so we will send the recording out to you all later. So we thank you for your questions and for your participation in today's event. And we look forward to seeing you hopefully soon at another one of our online lectures or at an in-person program. And in the meantime, I would invite you to join us on LinkedIn to take part in our online conversation with Columbia Business School alums, past participants, and members of the greater executive education community. On behalf of all of my colleagues here at Columbia, I thank you so much and hope to see you again in the near future. Thanks. Take care.